All right. We are back. Let's plug this over here. Philip and John, are we doing any introductions before we start this one, or we just continue on with this module?
I think we might just carry on with this module, Barry. I think we know you well from the afternoon, so
Afternoon or late evening here. All right, so let's start off in the chat section here. Let's see if this works. Because John says, "Oh, get all the links in." Let's see if this works better. Yay! Okay, it worked. So what I just shared in this chat is the first session, which was on the DDoS risk, factors. So about what's going on with the DDoS attacks and things like that. And there's a link to what I call the DDoS attack preparation workbook, which is a bunch of the different materials that I would be working with my colleagues, and I'd write up our experiences of here's how to basic ways to protect yourself and build resiliency stuff. And then we have the DNS under attack with that one. And then the one session we're going to be doing now, which is about having meaningful conversations with your vendors. This is let me go ahead and share the screen real quick here. And I'll fire up the slides. So let me give a bit of a background with this. I think in the previous sessions, you hear a consistent theme from my personal experience over the years of how we build resiliency in our networks, our services, our capabilities. And a lot of it deals with having these meaningful interactions with your peers, your vendors, your colleagues, right? It's the people. People attack you. People create the malware. People create the DOS attacks. People, do this. So, and then how do you protect yourself? It's that mesh and weave of relationships you build out there. Now, in that theme, if you're running a network, you build an infrastructure, you're dealing with vendors, right? You're dealing with operators. You're dealing with these are your business weave partnerships of how you're doing things within the industry, and you can't just abuse those. Those are precious to you, right? But you also need to make sure you hold them accountable, right? You got to be able to demand security from them. So you got to find out, do they have their act together? Because as we've seen, like with the SolarWinds case, these, if you don't look at these relationships and ask the right questions, you could run into big problems. So what you're going to be seeing in 2021 is a lot more emphasis on third-party interactions and your partners that are connected to your services, and whether they're doing their job as security professionals to protect your interest, all right, that business relationship with it. Now, you have a choice in the sense of three options. Option one is you just ignore it and forget about it, but then you're going to have consequences later, as people found out with SolarWinds. Or number two, you can be like, and you find this a lot, in different countries, where I'm going to beat up on the vendor. I'm going to beat you up. I'm going to yell and scream at you. And believe me, I've been in the days where I've been like a vendor side, like, with Cisco or Juniper when I was over there. I've been on the other end of, very irate customers mad because something that happened with a bug, took down half the network, right? And yelling and screaming, right? And you don't feel good coming out of that, right? And the challenge with that is you don't get a good tight relationship, because these things go through cycles. Things will happen. Humans touch networks, things will happen. So you work on the third one, which is to have a meaningful conversation that's non-threatening, a meaningful conversation that actually builds, rapport, a meaningful conversation where you have these conversations about what to do. And that's what this work is based off of. It's based off my experience that I found over the years, the most productive security when working with your vendors is having these meaningful security conversations. So what we have is we have two tools here that we'll have, and I shared with. We have this presentation, which we'll use it to talk through, and then I'll point to like the write-ups that keep on adding and growing. You know, I'll every now and then I'll come up with a new sort of approach to do. And this is designed to help you go through these meaningful conversations. In other words, it's not like you don't need to hire a consultant to do this. This is designed for any team to kind of walk through and say, oh wow, I can do that with my vendors. So so that's the idea around these, right? Um, so there's a link here that points to a shorter version of it, you know, on the Sunkey site, and then there's a longer version, and that longer version is designed for you to kind of like, you know, print out or download and use and kind of think through and have a conversation and pull the vendors in. It's kind of like an approach of doing it with it. And you'd be surprised when you sit down, when you use this technique, how much you can learn, how much you can discover, how much you can find out whether this is the vendor you really want to deal with. Do they have their act together, right? Because you ask these questions, and none of the questions are out of scope of or abusive. So in other words, these are written from somebody like myself that I collect because I've been on all sides. I've been on the side of the vendor. I've been on the side of building the expectations, like working in first.org and other groups that write the standards. I've been on the side of the consumer buying the stuff from the vendor, right? So being on all sides, none of these are like unreasonable questions to ask. So you don't feel bad as you go through these, and I'll point them out that they're not going to be like questions that go like, oh wow, you're being bad on the vendor. So no, they're not. So that's kind of like the ideas with it. Can vendors provide secure solutions? Nope. So that's one expectation to get out of. Oh, you need to make sure everything is secure. It's never going to be secure. I've done several times in my career where I says, I'm going to try to see, can we make this secure? Can we make this secure? Lots and lots of effort and time and effort and things like that. Human beings touch it. There's going to be something that overlooks somewhere, right? Which will show, like in the beginning, you know, having an ability to respond with this. It also means that you, as a network designer, those of you who are running networks, you cannot assume whatever you deploy, whether it's software or functions or equipment, is ever going to be secure. You're going to need to upgrade it. And a lot of times you're going to need to upgrade it quick, or you need to put a mitigation in quick, right? So seeing many times the scenarios where people say, yeah, I built my network. It says, yeah, but you need to upgrade the software right away. They found a vulnerability. Oh, I can't do that. Why? Because if I do that, then half my network goes down. Okay, right. Something happened here. So you gotta expect this. So this is one of the things in here that is everything in the architect with it, is you gotta expect that something's going to happen and I'm going to have to do a rapid upgrade or change or a configuration update to it. The reason why is because the bad guys want to get into your network. I've mentioned this in the last two sessions. They're going to figure out a way to get in. You just have to assume that. You also have to assume in some of the state actors, they're going to figure out, because these nation state factors, the same thing talked about, the pushes them back and forth with the, you know, that where you got an international justice problem, not a cybersecurity problem. And because this is going to last a while, you get these cycles of attacks to happen, right? And then a lot of times the vendors focus on the wrong problem. You know, they focus on the widgets and not the people, right? If somebody attacks a vulnerability in a router, somebody is attacking a vulnerability in a router. It's the somebody is the issue. The risk is that vulnerability. How you going to, you got those two factors in there. You got to look at it. Like for instance, on this is a question I asked: what if, you know, Mr. Vendor? So what if your vulnerability that you just announced, or you let me know about, what if it went active exploit? What if somebody started using it? What would you do? And the response they have is often affirmative. And the response they have, you don't want to get mad at them. You say like, okay, let's think this thing through. If somebody started using this, what do we need to do to protect my customers? What do we need to do to protect my interest? Right? Have the conversation in that way, right, with it. I'm just going to skip through this. We talked about the different threat vectors in here to get to this one. This is kind of like the new part. What are the consequences of these things? So this was an interesting thing several years ago. Back in 2015, I kind of pulled this data out there, which shows the 2013 and 2014 breaches. Um, and these are breaches that you see every day. You see, organizations are being breached with, in the breach cases, personal information is being stolen, right, and downloaded. And so you kind of look at this and big announcement, front page news, right? You figure, oh, are these guys going to wake up? And this is one of the factors to kind of look at with, are these, do we have checks and balances in the system? And this is where we don't have checks and balances in the system, because you look at each of these here. I looked at 4 of these. I looked at eBay, I looked at Home Depot, look at JP Morgan, look at Anthem, right? Each of these major breaches. So the red line you see off to the side there is the announcement of the breach. So this is their stock price, okay, over time. So you look at it as stock price over time. You look at there in September of 2014, eBay announced breach. Okay, what happens? Does the stock go down? No. Does the market penalize them? No. Oh, the stock spiked. And the stock went down, not because of the breach. It went down for something else. And it goes up and up and up and up and up and up and up. Right? So this is a factor to kind of like, some people will go like, oh my goodness, this is really horrible. The industry should be check and balance under the market doesn't penalize with this. And this is why some of the things that in these questions is to see how the vendors respond to the attacks, and are they going to panic over it, and how they're going to manage the press around it, right? And then understand that the press, the market forgives if you have your act together, right? So what you see over time is eBay, good security department, good PR department, good public relations department. Home Depot, same thing. JP Morgan, same thing. Anthem, same thing. The key thing is each of those teams in each of those organizations over time, even though they had a major breach, each of those teams worked really hard, worked with the vendors, worked on solving the problems. When people started asking what they're doing, they're able to actually write it out, right? And then, you're not seeing like, look at Home Depot there, breach, and then they kept on going. That's the 2015. You can see, wonder what it is today. But over time, one of the things that you got to look at is the liability flows downhill. And right now, within the world, you don't have liability chains that go down like you do like United States. If the auto manufacturer does something that you find is a big at fault, liability will flow downhill, right? So you're not getting this sort of liability chain that, like for instance, the CISA, United States, US, which is US CERT sits inside of CISA. They put an announcement that the 911 emergency services are getting DOS attacked. Okay, that's like this. It's ironic, they put that note out here, and I had this slide from way back years ago, right? And if the vendor around with that, the vendors with that, if they have particular flaws that are being exploited, are they liable? And in the way it works in society today is they're not liable. They don't get pulled into court. They don't get sued. That's just kind of like the state of where we are at today, because that's one of the ways you do checks and balances is you have cost consequences with it. That could change, and that's one of the things to look out for. But now that hasn't changed. So what we have, and I mentioned this before, the way I look at the world is in cybersecurity is it's a force of nature. It's just there. It's going to be there. You got to do work on it, and you kind of figure out which ones are important to my business and which ones do I have to keep mindful of. This technique of interacting with your vendors in a meaningful way that actually builds knowledge, builds trust, is one of those things of preparing, right? And it's right out of there. Like if you're preparing for earthquakes and tornadoes and natural disasters and hurricanes and things like that, then you want to have a team that works together and prepares around it. So that's the concept around it. So the key thing is these threat vectors are not going to go away. The market's not going to penalize the companies. The massive growth of the economic ecosystem, there isn't any checks and balances on it, right? if somebody comes out with a vulnerable IoT device, nobody's going to sue them, right? So, going through and getting upset over this, it can get you upset because it's a consequence on you. But what I'm proposing is you kind of have, regular meetups with the vendors or in your network, right? So you got to take care of your customers and as a forces of nature. So this process I kind of built because it was influenced around these meaningful conversations. I was built around a checklist manifesto. Now, if you run a network, this is a book that the person who turned me onto this book, Stephen Stewart, he was running a big operations team at Google at the time, and they bought this book and gave it to a whole bunch of people at Google. Said, read this book, and you can get a shortcut to this link, this TED Talk, so you can listen to Atul talk about this. And the premise of this guy's a doctor, right? And what he was looking at in this approach was he was looking at how come a post operational deaths of heart surgery, because he was a heart surgeon, in South Africa was lower than anywhere in the world, right? South Africa had, you go into the best place in the world to have a safe open heart surgery was South Africa. In other words, you went in, you had your heart surgery, you got out, you were healthy. Other parts of the world, you went in, you had your heart surgery, post-infection, complications, other things happen, right? That's other places of the world. And South Africa was like, what's going on? So he goes down there, and that's where he starts out this story about what's going on with the checklist. Is you found out that what they did in South Africa is every heart surgery, they basically have a checklist. Everybody in the operating theater had a checklist. Everybody walked through when they stepped in and they said, okay, checklist, A, B, C, D. And they got through this checklist, as they prepared for the operation, as they did the operation, as they did the post-operation, as they went into recovery, everybody had a checklist, right? And you look at this, and when I read through this is so obvious because I come from the military background. In the military, we use checklists all the time. The U.S. Navy electronics program, the way they train people is with checklist. You basically said, oh, this is broke. I'm going to write a checklist. And you followed your checklist of your hypothesis of troubleshooting. And if you didn't follow that checklist, you failed the lab, right? So this is a principle that when Stephen kind of shared this with me, I go like, holy cow, we're missing this in the way we do operations in the internet today because we don't follow the checklist, right? And I see that organizations out there that run a really good operation that have minimal human error run these checklists. So based off that principle, I was doing this whole thing about meaningful security conversations. So it's kind of like a checklist. Do this one first, then the next one, then the next one, then the next one. So these conversations are kind of like, a build up over time. You take, the principle of building the checklist, you take care of the simple things first, make sure you got everything kind of figured out, right? And then work to the next one, and then work to the next one. And it takes you down a journey as you go down the checklist, right? So the key thing here is to build that rigor and the discipline. And you'd be doing it with multiple vendors. So you use the same sort of checklist of the conversation with each of the vendors you come in. If you're doing an RFP, I've used this for RFPs where we're evaluating vendors and we walk through the same sort of security conversations, the same sort of checklist, right? And it seems redundant and seems boring, but it would be amazed how you do it, right? Because what you're trying to do is get to the end goal, right? Whether the end goal is figuring out which vendor I want to purchase, or to find out what their security practices are, or to find out, if I'm looking for like security help because something's changed on the internet. This is kind of like the idea with it. Now, the principle around this is schedule regular meetings. Set up the time where I'm bringing in, here's my 6 most valuable vendors, and here's my regular meetings. I meet up with them. Sometimes they want to do quarterly business reviews with it, right? Don't let the vendor set the agenda for the quarterly business review. You look through this checklist and put these checklists as part of your quarterly business reviews or a monthly business review, right? Also, when you do it, send the questions over to them and ask them to do it in writing. And this is really, really important in Asia Pacific, right? In the apricot region. because for many, many people, English is second language, but English is the business language. So I'll give you an example. I go into Indonesia to help turn around a cell phone company, and I immediately see the problem. I'm sitting down with the team, and my team is all speaks Bahasa Indonesian, right? And English is a second language. And they're arguing with the vendor from China. The vendor from China speaks Chinese, and speaks Mandarin, some Cantonese, and English is a second language. And they're arguing with each other in the second language. And after the first meeting, I said, okay, guys, here's what we're going to do. Write down your questions and send it to them beforehand. Write it down in English. Oh, no, we should be just say, they should understand me. No, if English is everybody's translating, you're doing through multiple layers of translating. So you write it down. So here's the stuff. So we're doing a security review using some of these questions on a security review. So let's write it down, send it over to them. Send it a couple of days ahead. Here's the agenda, right? And the first one we did with that, we sent the questions over, gave them a few days. Vendor comes in. We have big write-ups in English, in detail. So instead of arguing back and forth, now we're actually looking at what they responded with, and we're asking questions on that. Write down notes. We send questions back to them. We get more written back. All right. So writing things down to your vendors. Some people may say, oh, I just sent them a text or sent them an email or I yelled at them at the meeting. Write it down, because what you're trying to do is get key things out of it. The other thing is, don't expect perfection, right? Because a lot of times they may not understand, they may not have the process, they may have never thought of it, or they don't know who to talk to in sort of organization. Because you may be talking to a sales team and a support team, and they don't know who exactly to talk to. So ask the question, they come back with a response. Don't expect perfection. Then you say, okay, let me ask it this way, and then expect gaps. So if they have a gap, if they say, we don't have a written security development lifecycle. So okay, how are you going to do a security development lifecycle in the future? Okay, all right. So you're not expecting perfection. They may not have it right now, but they may get it in the future, and they come back to you, right? So that's where you ask for the vendor's resolution plan. So you see with this takes it less confrontational, and what you're trying to do is build this healthy security conversation with your vendors you have in there. So let's walk through some examples of some of these questions. So like, for instance, you ask them, do you have a vulnerability management process? Like if you have, you ask it, if I find a vulnerability, how do I report it to you? Right. And there's so many times where a vendor look at me and go like, I don't know. I don't know. And they look around at each other and says, okay, let's work on that. Right. If you have a vulnerability, how do you send it to me? Right. That's part of the vulnerability management process. Those are the basics. Right. And if they don't have that, they need to do that. Right. So don't whack them. Right. It says, okay, if I go to your website and if somebody finds something and they need to report a vulnerability, where do they send it? Do you have a /security? And is /security pointing to your security services and products, or is /security telling you, how do I report a vulnerability? It's really, really frustrating. I see this all the time. I see questions all the time within the security trust groups I'm on. The people who are researching malware, they say, does anybody know how to contact this vendor? I found this problem with this IoT. I found this problem with this piece of software. I had found this problem in this particular vendor. And we don't know how to contact them, right? We don't know how to get to the right person. The bad guys are breaking into this. We don't know who to call to get this patch fixed. You get this, the vulnerability fix. So you ask those things. How does somebody who's outside report to you, right? Do you have a response team? Like if I called you in the middle of the night, who picks up the phone for a security issue, right? And can it be is the conversation in English or a different language? It's okay to be in different language because we live in countries, different places. Just get that clarity out there, right? So you kind of see the sort of questions out here. It builds up this idea with it. Do you ask the organization, ask the vendor, do you participate in vulnerability and incident response teams? Like, who's your national CERT, right? Or who's your national security organization? Like, it was really funny one time. We had this big RFP going on, And the two of the vendors were Chinese vendors. This is on a 4G network, so you can guess who they are, with ZTE and Huawei, right? And nothing against them. The SEs in there were so upset because in the RFPs with some of these meaningful questions, I was using NIST and UK and EU, security requirements. And he said, like, this is not fair. These are all Western, started saying, these are all Western requirements. This is not fair. I said, like, okay, what's the standards organization in China for security? I'll use the one in China too, because a security standard is a security standard. Security expectations. You'll find out that if you had an organization in country X and a country in country Y, you'll find that they're pretty much the same thing. They're trying to make the network safer. And the guy looked at me silent. I said, like, okay, well, if there is, let me know. I'll put it in there. They'll be part of the RFP requirements. Never got back, and so we still used it. But that's where you asked, do they participate in sort of these sort of groups out there? Are they a member of first.org? Do they know what first.org is? First.org, if you don't know what that is, check it out. That's a list of security organizations, and they have certain practices they follow for doing incident response and vulnerability management. All right, and you have governments and private sector participations in there. All right. Then you get into something deeper. Do you have a security development lifecycle? Like when you write code, how do you secure it? If you find a vulnerability, what's your process for doing root cause corrective action? How do I know that when you fix the vulnerability, it won't come back again? Right. The most ridiculous report ever saw on that, where the lack of a good root cause corrective action to make sure the problem doesn't go in, was this report from the UK government, UK National CERT team. They set up the special office for Huawei equipment in UK. This is really funny because I know the guys in UK who had to be assigned to that team, and they would find a vulnerability in an E-node-B. They certify, here's a vulnerability. They said, okay, I'm going to fix it. All right. And then here's another version, different timestamp, different version code, not fixed. And they say, here it is again. It's a different branch. What's going on? And you go say, okay, we're going to fix it. Comes back, there it is again. Oh, no, we fixed it. See, this is a new version of code. But no, the problem's still there. You're not fixing it. Right. And this is this happens if you don't, inside of a company, as you grow too fast. What happens is companies who grow fast, they don't take a step back and actually build these cycles and make sure they get the code fixed. And if you, as the purchaser of the equipment, don't ask these questions, there's no push for them to actually fix it. Right. And some of the stuff gets easier, like in the cloud environment, sort of DevOps world. This last one here on static analysis and testing, you get like GitHub, who's doing static analysis and testing within the build structure. So some of the new things I'm adding there is like, what build structure that they use? Do they use GitHub repositories, or do you use some of the tools like that? Then you throw a harder question at them. See, this builds up questions. You throw a harder one and said, okay, do you use test-driven development? And it's always interesting to find out, one, do they know what test-driven development is? And two, you learn a lot about, if they do, different ways that people do it. Test-driven development is this methodology where when you write code, before you write your code, you write the expectations of how you should be testing the code if it works right. So when you compile it and test it, you say, here's the things that should happen. So it's a coding methodology. So it gets you to think of the end first, then write the code, right? Instead of writing the code and figure out how to test it, you write the test first. So this is kind of like a very simplified version of TDD. And what I find is companies who have coding practices that use TDD and variants of TDD have code that is much more resilient and easier to fix. So when they find a vulnerability, they go like, oh, wait a minute. Okay, I wrote the test wrong. So this got through. Okay, all right, got it fixed. All right, and here's the test, put in regression, and we'll put in some dynamic tests, and things like that. you ask questions of them like, do they know what this common vulnerability scoring system, common weakness enumeration, and things like that? You ask them, do they know these things? It's okay if they don't know, because a lot of companies, especially like startups and younger companies, won't know these things, but you ask them. And sometimes you need to teach them. Sometimes they'll come over and say, oh, here's how we use it. And they go, ah, okay, I learned something new from the vendor, right? Ask them how they test. How do they test for regression, stress tests, performance testing, things like that? That's really important. Like, so those sort of factors with it. Do they know about fuzz testing? See, all this sort of thing with it. How they test the stuff will help you gain confidence of what they're coding for you and what you're putting on your network, right? Then you get into another conversation. This is a third conversation because these get deep. These like you spend an hour or two. You don't want to do it all at once. So this could be like one quarter, then the next quarter, then the next quarter, and it kind of builds up this capability. So every time you like for instance, one suggestion is do this in the QBRs. It gives you an idea with it. So you go in there and say, okay, do you do third-party penetration tests? Do you have people who do postmortems on security testing? Would you be willing to come to one of our tabletop exercises? Like, we're going to hire somebody to take us through a security exercise, and you send somebody over to participate with us and do this kind of like tabletop role play to kind of see how we would work with each other, right? And see what the response is with that. And hopefully the response is positive. A good example of that is, um, a story I give about CNN. In 1999, I did a workshop with them when I was teaching earlier versions of these materials, and I said we should do a tabletop exercise so you have all the vendors. Oh, that's a great! And so we sent some people for Atlanta, and we did a tabletop exercise with them about a worst case scenario of a DOS attack. Okay, so then several months later, I get a phone call from the account team in CNN and say, oh, okay, we think we're going to get attacked during the elections in 2000. I go, oh, really? Why do you think that? It says, well, some of this tools you asked us to deploy, we deploy, and we see people taking increased interest, and we're gonna get a DOS attack here. So we're walking through the checklist of a checklist manifesto. We're walking through the checklist that we built at the tabletop exercise, and we're talking to all of our vendors. So here they are, that we're talking them as a customer. CNN was going through every single one of their vendors, and they're talking through that checklist. And they did prepare. They had everybody in place, and then the elections happened, and this was the Bush Gore. So everybody was going to CNN, and they're checking the website. So they had a surge load because everybody's trying to figure out who won the elections, and a DOS attack. They had everybody in place. They did the preparation beforehand, the joint tabletop exercise, and everything was ready to go. And they kept the website up and running because everybody, this preparation of the joint tabletop exercise. So this is an example of where this pays off, of having a relationship that way versus a conflictable, where you're combating each other. You're actually doing this more collaborative relationship with it, with the vendors with it. All right. So that gives you an idea of these things. So, we have the joint reaction plans is another conversation. What are you doing with cryptography and several others? So what I'm going to do right now is just pop out of this and jump over to the guide. So on here, this is over here. This kind of is a talk through the same thing. This is kind of like, I'll update this, probably, every other month. I'll find here's another one I found out in talking to different colleagues, right? And you could put these in RFP questions also. So this is something you can actually craft and put into an RFP response, right? So you have these meaningful security conversations. So you kind of get an idea of this, the same thing of why to ask and write in, have the NDA disclosures in place. This is kind of like a healthy security habit to get with it. And it really asks the vendors to respond in writing. Don't just send me an email. Do a little doc. And these days, it gets easier and easier. I mean, I do. I insist on doing that. I'll talk to a customer and says, "Here, let me write it up for you. I'll dump it into a Google Doc and send a Google Doc over." Right? So it's just so easy to express yourself that way these days. right? And don't expect perfection. So you kind of walk through this and you can see what this conversation around it. So this is kind of like the model around it. Um, it's worked quite well over the years. Let me just go back to presentation mode here. Love to get other questions on it. This conversation 7, the supply chain, that's like really popping up. There's a section I haven't added in yet on chipsets. So one of the things that slipped out from last week was, I need to dig into this. Apparently there was a supply chain violation on some laptops that were sold to the US military, where there is also broken into the home beacon for the maintenance and sending code out to a nation state actor. Supply chain violation. How, this is where you got to have the trust with the vendor, and at the same time you got to figure out, are they thinking through all these? Because a lot of times if you don't ask the questions, they don't think through it. There's so many times that these sort of partnerships, like I would be talking to one of our customers and the customer would bring out something that says, oh, we never thought of that. And then we'll get, when I'm in vendor mode, and then get into like, okay, we got to figure out how to find out if it's a risk, and then, work through it. So, and I'm always looking for suggestions. So if you go through here and you practice this and you got more conversation suggestions, send them over. Give you credit. We'll add it in there into the list, because these sort of meaningful security conversations is what makes it it grows with it. What's your experience of working with vendors, right? So some of the questions you can put in here is, some of the things you might have been asking them. Like new questions, like how does your organization track the miscreants? Do they work with some of the trust groups? Do they even know what trust groups are? Does your organization work? How do you work with the law enforcement when law enforcement comes over to you, right? And then, what do you do if your vendors don't respond? With me, vendors who didn't respond to this sort of stuff, I went to the bosses, the people I reported up to, and said, we got a risk. If they're not responding to these things, and these are not unreasonable questions and conversations to have, then we need to find somebody different. And that's kind of like a response to have with that. So in all of these, notice these with the guide, you don't need to be a security expert to ask these questions, because some people says, oh, I don't know anything about security. You don't need it. You just pull down the guide and say, so here's a question, how do you do this? And then what happens many times, the good vendors will come in there and says, oh, here's what we do with test-driven development. Here's our process. And they'll come in with 20 slides about their test-driven development process. And you go like, oh, wow, I just learned about test-driven development. That's cool. Thank you. Now I know more about security, right? I configure routers in my network. I didn't know about test-driven development on microcode. That's pretty cool. All right, good. Thank you. Good. You build up trust, respect between you and your partners that you need to run your business. So now we're question time. Vincent's got a good one. If the market doesn't penalize, why spend so much in security? I mean, the C-suite will use the same graph to show, despite the security patch, there's no longer a financial impact. Spend so much on security, it's easier to forgive the market. Now, what are the factors in there? And Vincent, that's a really good point with it. That's this whole industry dysfunction we're trapped into. Going down the path of, we're in this whirlwind, right? Because a lot of the people here at Apricot, we're at that level that we face the consequences with it. One of the things I do know is, if you are in C-suite and those things happen, one of the ways that the company and the board of directors take care of the market expectations is they go out and start firing the C-suite. The roughest job in the security industry is being a CISO, because there's so much at risk. You're in the middle of a whirlwind. You're going to get hit. It's not if you're going to get hit, it's you're going to get hit. And if the board of directors don't like what's going on, they're going to take care of their shareholder interest, because they know if they take care of the shareholder interest and rebuild confidence. And how do we rebuild confidence? Fire you and bring in somebody else. Does that solve the problem, the security problem? Nope. So Vincent, to that sense, that's one of the techniques that happen in there. So if you go back to those 4 companies I gave examples with, and you look what happened to the CISOs, that's one of the ways the market went up. Does it fix any security problems? Nope. Did it help the stock go back up? Yep. So it's and then Vincent asked the question: is it it is just getting the CISO to be the standby scapegoat and have another one ready? Yeah, that's why some people ask me, I've been doing this for a long time, and they say, how come you're not a CISO? There's a reason I'm not a CISO. you know so and that's one of the reasons why I'm not a CISO. I'd rather be in the path of getting my services I'm building more resilient, more secure. Like one of the things I'm having a blast with on this, since we have a little extra time, is inside Akamai, there's a guy named Ruben that I work with in the InfoSec team. And in Akamai, I'm building stuff. I'm building new stuff. I'm not security is part of everything, but I'm building new services and things. But Ruben came up with an InfoSec risk assessment methodology. And everybody was thinking it's a security assessment. We have to do this on everything we build. So we build, here's a new function. We have to do this process on it. And it was brand new and people were kind of all confused. And I was reading through it. And then I was talking to a company on helping with their security in a chemical plant. And then I reflected what Ruben wrote and said, wait a minute, Ruben's done an industrial control system. Oh, this is brilliant. We're using industrial control systems because what happens in a cloud environment, AWS, you build something in AWS, you build something Azure, you build something with Akamai widgets in the DevOps world, your resiliency, the risk factors you run into is more like a chemical plant, right? Because you have like the big pipe trying to get into the small pipe, right? And the small pipe only can take so much bandwidth or so much packets per second. And if you overload it, then everything kind of like, chemical valves, things like that, it all kind of knocks out. And it's a fun methodology with it that it's really working out well, really fits. So instead of doing like a traditional security assessment, we're using an industrial control risk assessment model to actually build resiliency that leads to security. Because all those different elements, if you don't have the pipes fit correctly, so the back end data flows that you get within like a edge or a cloud infrastructure, then everything can fall apart. And you find the same thing in 5G and 4G networks. That sort of model works. And you may find it work in whatever network you're working on today, right? So that you look at these risk assessment methodologies. And that's fixing things. These are the sort of things to fix things. These are also good questions to ask to the, any of the vendor you work with, right? Sort of thing. So those are good questions. Other questions, let's see. From someone, learning automation. See, Vincent mentioned something to from learning automation, how to do it automatically so as to remove the human error in the process. Yeah, I mean, what sort of automation is going on inside of the vendor? That's really good. That's what sort of automation? Like, how do you remove human error from the process? Like, a good mantra in, because we have a lot of backbone operators in ISPs around the apricot community, right? The mantra I hear and we have this in Akamai is people don't touch routers. If a person touches a router, you have a way high chance of human error, and then you have a network problem, right? So you have your script and automation tools, and you have your test tools, and you just don't touch, humans don't touch routers. If a human touch a router, you break it. Some of the biggest network outages that we've ever seen, which are network outages for network issues, were not caused by bugs, not caused by DOS attacks. They're caused by a misconfiguration by a human being, right? So that's an example Vincent asked on that one about automation. So that's a good question to add on there. What sort of automation are you putting in to reduce the human error risk, right? That's a that's a good one to have. So thanks for sharing that one. Other questions? Okay. Philip, John, team, I think we're good. No more questions. I really appreciate everybody's time. Hopefully these materials are helpful to you. And again, contact me. I'm on the West Coast United States these days during the COVID lockdown, but like I am right now, I'm up late at night. I love talking to people. Philip, I want to catch up with you guys. John too. I mean, John, we haven't seen each other in like a long time. Right. So, and that's the sort of thing that happens, as I mentioned in other talks, get to know people at Apricot in the community, reach out to them, not just within Apricot, but outside. So that way, that saves your butt many different times when you're stuck with something. You're like, oh, I need some help. Who do I call? And call somebody.
Yes, remember those days, well, when we were all doing this stuff and it was who to call, and it was call Barry because he knows somebody who he can call.
And then I'll find somebody else and say, oh, I don't know that, but let me, and then 3 calls later and we find somebody.
It's the human network, absolutely, so important. But yeah, you're right. That's the whole point of these events and conferences and so forth. So, no, that's been great. So on behalf of Apricot, Barry, thank you so much for giving up it's almost 4 hours, I think you've given up in your evening, almost late night. Really appreciate this. Great to see you back helping out with the tutorials at Apricot. And as I've been saying to the other instructors during the week, if we can do this in person next year, that would be so good.
Yay.
I think we've all got virtual event fatigue these days. So
Indeed.
Really appreciate. Thanks to all the participants for joining as well. Hope it's been useful. As I was saying at the start, this session has been recorded. It'll be up on the Apricot website probably after the event is completed. So if you missed something or think, did he really say that? You can go back and listen to it all over again.
Or ask me to say it again in a different form.
Exactly. So anyway, so thanks very much, Barry. Thanks, John, for helping with the questions. And well, for the participants, we'll see you again next week. Please join the conference starting at 2 p.m. Manila time for the opening plenary. So I hope you will come and join us for that. Otherwise, enjoy your weekends and see you online soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.